Okay, good morning. So this is Baruch Hashem. I've been have had the zchut of giving shiurim here now for 10 years, and so this is a topic that I come back to every few years. And each time, it's a little bit different. Last time I did this was, I think, 4 years ago. And I realized actually after I had sent it to print, as it were, it was a little bit too late, that I should have done it a little bit, one more change. So, next time, Mirz Hashem, in another few years, it'll be on the sheets, but I'll tell you what the change is now, right?
20 years, the next cycle.
Okay, so right. It's like, 20 years, okay, next time we talk about Erev Pesach Shechal B'Shabbat, and I'll say that. We'll talk about Sfira. Hopefully, Sfira will come. Sfira comes every year, and that's the psukim that we see, right? Usfartem lachem mimacharat Shabbat, miyom haviachem et Omer atnufa sheva Shabbatot tamimot tiyena, ad mimacharat Shabbat hashviit tisperu 50 yom v'ikravtem mincha chadasha l'Hashem. It's the Torah speaks of the Sfira in a as what it is, as a interim period, a transition period between bringing the Korban Omer on the second day of Pesach and bringing the Korban of the Shtei Halechem, the 2 loaves of bread, on Shavuot, basically the beginning of the harvest season and the end of the harvest season. That's what those 2 Korbanot represent. The beginning of the barley harvest, which is Pesach time, and the wheat harvest, which is completed come Shavuot, and that's what this whole period is, from the agricultural perspective, is commemorating and celebrating, in the sense that you have that korban at the beginning, you have the korban at the end, and of course, we over the course of the generations, perhaps already embedded in the Torah Shaval Peh, but the notion of also looking at it from the move from Yetziat Mitzrayim to Shavuot to Matan Torah. In other words, you also have that historical religious significance. And this is not the topic of this year, but just something to keep in mind, that when you look at it, right, in the Sfira itself, so the Sfira can be viewed retrospectively, looking back to Pesach, or you could be looking at prospectively towards what we are going to be celebrating. Right, today is the 25th of the day of the Omer, so we're at the halfway point now. So exactly 25 days from now, Bezrat Hashem, we will be celebrating Shavuot. So that and just one last knitch on what I'm not talking about is that's the difference also between the 2 versions of how you count it. Do you count it as La Omer, or do you count it as Ba Omer? Now, just from a Hebrew grammatical perspective, La is retrospective. It's like the Ba'asiri La Chodesh. Let's say if you're talking about Yom Kippur, the 10th day, La Chodesh, the beginning of the new moon, was 10 days previously. Whereas Ba is prospectively, that's what we said this just as a morning, Hayom Yom Chamishi Ba Shabbat. Right? So that means that we're looking ahead towards the Shabbat, and so when you say those 2 versions are really, there's a very it's a two different sides, perhaps of the same coin, but very important sides of the coin. Rav Soloveitchik's minhag was to say both, right? And because of that, and there's a lot more to be said. That's a shir in of itself, but that's what it is in terms of the count. And of course, we are familiar with the fact that it's not just an interim period and not just the mitzvah of the counting in of itself, but it also has it's taken on itself a life of its own. Right? The different minhagim of Avelut during Sfirat Omer, and the break on Lag BaOmer. BaOmer, by the way, if you take a look, Sfardim say generally La, and Ashkenazic is Ba. So if you take a look in the Shulchan Aruch, when he talks about Lag BaOmer, it's not Lag BaOmer, but it's Lag La Omer. Okay, that's how he writes, because of the being consistent with that. And that's something which is new. Lag BaOmer. There was many years ago they didn't do it as well as they should have. But there was somebody put out an early meme of Sfirat HaHomer. They took Homer Simpson, and each day there was another picture of Homer. But they didn't do it as well as they should have. That they should have if they were really investing in time, have a different picture of Homer every day of the Omer. But it was like every day was the same picture of Homer until Lag BaOmer, and then Lag BaOmer it was Homer doing some celebratory act, right? So, but that idea, Lag BaOmer, right, is something which is, where does that come from? So that's what we're going to be talking about now. The if you will, this new life of giving significance to the Omer and part of the Omer itself, and not just looking at it as the bridge between Pesach and Shavuot. And so, as I said earlier, what would I have done differently? And now, I thought about it literally just this morning, was that I would take what I'm going to do now, which is the first source, the Shulchan Aruch. I just take the Shulchan Aruch to give a sense of the Shulchan Aruch, and then I'll tell you the next source. Right, the two sources which I would have introduced, and as we go on. So let's first quickly read the Shulchan Aruch, just to get a sense of what the Minhagim, and there have been some variations. I'm not going to talk about too much about the variations since the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, because those are more detail oriented. More just to take a look at the Shulchan Aruch, because the core of it is basically the same. It hasn't changed all that much. Noagim shelo lisa isha ben Pesach la'atzeret ad lag la'omer. Right, as I said. Mipnei shebaoto zman metu talmidei Rabbi Akiva. So the Shulchan Aruch tells us that there's a minhag not to have marriages between Pesach and Shavuot until lag la'omer, because this is when the students of Rabbi Akiva passed away tragically. Aval la'ares l'kadesh shapir dami. But in terms of engagements, so that's okay. V'nisuin nami, and also with regard to marriages, misha kafatz v'kanas enon shinoto. If if people got married, as it were, without the rabbi, right? So then we don't sanction them in any way. The Ramah adds, Haga, miu bilag ba'omer. So you see already the difference in the Minhagim, right? He's calling lag ba'omer. Ve'elach hakol shari, right? Once lag ba'omer passes, so everything is permissible. Okay, that's the first seif. Seif bet, nohagim shelo lihistaper ad lag la'omer. So we also have a minhag not to take haircuts until lag ba'omer. Shomrim sha'az pasku lamut, because it is said that that's when they ceased to die. Ve'en lihistaper, but you shouldn't take a haircut ad lag baboker. It is not on lag ba'omer, but you should wait until the 34th day of the Omer in the morning. Ela imken chal yom lag erev Shabbat, unless, as this year, so it is indeed connected to our year specifically, if lag ba'omer falls on Friday, and that only happens when you have a Purim Mishulash and when you have erev Pesach Shechaliot b'Shabbat. So good. So we've touched it as well. As mistaprin bo mipnei kvod Shabbat. So now, in other words, and this is the minhag of this, the dominant minhag of the Sfaradim until this day, not to have haircuts on lag ba'omer, but to shave and to have haircuts already on only on the following day, unless, as it happens this year, where they can't have a haircut on Shabbat, so then they will do it on Friday. Haga, Now the Ramah speaks. Uv'midinot elu eino agin kidvarav. So that is the Sephardic minhag. But in our communities, that we don't have that minhag. Elamistaprin miyom lag. Right? We Ashkenazim take their haircuts all the time on Lag BaOmer. Marbim bo k'tzat simcha. And now something that's being introduced. There's a little bit of joy on Lag BaOmer itself. Ve'ein omrim bo tachanun. Right, so that's a lot of joy. You don't say, right? Because you don't say tachanun, right? Ve'ein lihistaper ela ad lag ba'atzmo v'lo mi be'erev. However, you shouldn't have the haircut on the eve of Lag BaOmer, but you should wait till the daytime. Miu imchal biyom rishon. So now we have issues here. If Lag BaOmer falls on Sunday, noagin lihistaper biyom vav lichvod Shabbat. So then you can get your haircut on Lamed Aleph BaOmer, right? Because if on Friday, in order to have Shabbat, no, you shouldn't wait till Sunday to get your haircut. Mi shehu bal brit omal bino. So what about somebody during the course of Svira who is the Baal Brit, meaning the sandak, or is the father of the boy getting the Brit? Reason why the sandak is called the Baal Brit is that traditionally the sandak pays for the Brit. Okay, pays for it. So now you understand why the grandfather is frequently the sandak. Okay, mutar lihistaper b'svira lichvod hamila. So those people, right? If it's in the middle of Sfirat Omer, they can take their haircuts on as well on the day. By the way, this is not the extension, but it's the same idea, right? Obviously on a different level entirely. Why we take haircuts on, but not haircuts necessarily. That's a bit of a question. But why? That's certainly shaving on for Yom HaAtzmaut, but that's a different discussion. Yesh doagim lihistaper. So now Gimel. So now yesh doagim lihistaper berosh chodesh Iyar. This is the Shulchan Aruch talking. Now there are those who will get their haircut on Rosh Chodesh Iyar, v'ta'ut hu biyada. But this is a mistake. This is a minhag which is incorrect. Haga, the Ramah, miu beharbe mekomot noagim listaper at Rosh Chodesh Iyar. So there are those, now something which is new. There are many places where the minhagim of Sfirat HaOmer, this Avelut, don't begin before Rosh Chodesh Iyar. V'otan lo yistapru milag ba'omer ve'elach. So those people who wait until Rosh Chodesh Iyar, and Rosh Chodesh Iyar, by the way, is included in the time which it's permitted to have haircuts. Right? It's then to have people get married. Right? Different minhagim. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Etc. So those people who are in the common parlance, the second minhag, meaning from Rosh Chodesh Iyar on, lo yistapru b'Lag BaOmer. So they shouldn't take a haircut after Lag BaOmer. Afa pi shemutar liyistaper b'Lag BaOmer ba'atzmo. But Lag BaOmer, even in this other minhag that starts on Rosh Chodesh Iyar and goes until Shavuot, this you have Homer dancing on Lag BaOmer regardless. V'otan mekomot, excuse me, shedogid listaper me Lag BaOmer ve'elach lo yistaper klal achar Pesach ad Lag BaOmer. In other words, but if you are finishing at Lag BaOmer, so then you shouldn't be double dipping, as it were, and having, okay, we'll start in Rosh Chodesh Iyar and we'll finish on Lag BaOmer, and we'll have 18 days of, actually 17 days until 16 days if you don't include the Aleph and you don't include the Yudchet, right? We'll have that. Don't do that. And I'll say ideally, because of course with Jewish history this has become somewhat defunct, but the idea that you shouldn't have in the same locale two different minhagim. And that's because of an Isur D'Oraita, Mishum Lo Titgodedu, right? That you shouldn't have different communities with different practices in the same within the same location that will create all sorts of strife, and that's a major topic to be discussed at another time. And certainly, as I said, you should have double dipped and to have it in both ways. Yeah.
I questioned something you said earlier. I don't understand the reasoning between taking a haircut on Friday, Erev Shabbat, which is Erev Lag BaOmer. Why does that Shabbat mean more than the Shabbat before that? I mean, Lag BaOmer is after Shabbat.
Right. So, again, how did it develop? Where did it develop? Right. Again, it's hard to say. Presumably, the idea is saying you're almost at the finish line. You look like, you look like a minuvol because remember you haven't taken a haircut during Chol HaMoed. You haven't. It's been if you've grown your beard, that's the standard of the avelut is 30 days, a regular shloshim, and so now you look as though it's shloshim. You're right. Lag BaOmer is there, but it is an indication that it's an indication that this minhag or the minhagim of avelut aren't very deeply entrenched. In other words, it's not saying, okay, you wouldn't. You're right. You wouldn't say something like, okay, Tisha B'Av is Sunday, as it is this year, and so Tisha B'Av is Sunday, so get a haircut on Friday l'chvod Shabbat, right? Nobody would ever dream of saying something like that, right? But the idea that all of these minhagim, right? Like just even the way that the Shulchan Aruch phrased it. Why? Right? Because he said, first of all, mipnei they died at that time, and then she'omrim she'az paskul lamot. There are those who say it, and we have to see the primary sources, which we'll take a look at right now. But it's not nearly deeply entrenched as the period between Shiva B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av.
That's the question. How did Sphira today become equal to the 3 weeks? I mean, that's more and more you read this and you realize, first of all, you realize the Pesach to Shavuos before the students of Rabbi Akiva could shut up was a happy period, right, because of the harvest. So today we've turned, I think, Sphira into the 3 weeks. Okay, so we can talk about that. We'll see if we have time to get to it towards the end in terms of just the modern. By the way, I see indications in the contraindications in the other direction, but we'll talk about that. Hopefully, we'll reach it. I'm sorry.
Does anyone mention Rosh Chodesh Iyar falling on Shabbat?
Does someone mention Rosh Chodesh Iyar falling on Shabbat? Not in this context. It is mentioned. We'll get to touch upon it in a different context in a little bit. So what would I have added here? Okay. So if I tell the Shulchan Aruch is working off the Tur, right? That's of course the Tur is the one who put this the Siman system in, right? And so the Shulchan Aruch he wrote a commentary to the Tur, the Beit Yosef, and the Shulchan Aruch is his summary, halacha l'maaseh, of his commentary, the Beit Yosef. So it's following the Tur. This siman of Tav Tzadi Gimel 493 in Orach Chaim, the Tur also deals with the minhagim of Avelut. I would say, I don't know, I'll just say half. I think it's more than half of what you find in the Shulchan Aruch isn't found in the Tur already. In other words, it's already just in the few centuries between the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch, things have already developed. The whole mention of what the Ramah talks about this different minhag starting on Rosh Chodesh Iyar and going to Shavuot has absolutely no mention in the Tur. Not mentioned at all. So I said I should have put the Tur in, then you say, wow, see what happened. Then the third source would be the Rambam, right, before the Tur. And the Rambam has not a word about it. It would just be a blank, because there is no Rambam about the idea of the avelut of during the this period of Sfirat HaOmer. In other words, you see, right, if you're looking in that direction, how within a few hundred years, it literally went from 0 to 60, or 0 to 33. Okay? Because that's basically what happened, is that, you see that this is, during this particular time period, is when this minhag, and we'll call it a minhag, of avelut during Sfira develops, and afterwards, okay, the minhag is on its way, and then it will go into its various forms. So, what is this? Right? We say, okay, this is where Rabbi Akiva students died. So it's found in the Gemara in Yevamot, but in a different context, and the context is important. The context is with regard to marriage and remarriage, etc. So the Gemara says the following: Tanya, Rabbi Yoshua Omer, Nasa Adam Isha Bialduta, Yisa Isha Biziknuta. If a person married when he was young and tragically was widowed, so he should marry in his later life as well. Hayulo banim biyalduto, yulo banim biziknuta. If you had children when you were younger, you should have children when you were old. By the way, just the ages, what young and old is, has changed, right? Just I was driving in, I was listening to a podcast about the diary of Glickel of Hamburg, and so there's talking how she married she had two marriages, and so she married her first husband died after 30 years. She married when she was 14, right? So she was a widow with 12. She had 14 children, 12 children who made it into adulthood. But she had 12 children at the age of 43 that she had to deal with. And then it's possible, by the way, that we could thank that widow for the book, because it seems that she wrote it as sort of as therapy to deal with her grief. She wrote her memoirs, and then she then she remarried afterwards. So when we talk about her biziknuto, it's a person in their 30s and their 40s. All right, that's what we're talking about, right? When people's lifespans, you can expect to be living into your 40s and maybe your 50s. So it has a different context. In any event, so this is what the idea is. So and it's based on a pasuk. Baboker zarad zaracha ula'erev al tanech yadecha. Right. So in the morning, sow your field, and in the evening, do not rest. Ki encha yodea eze yichshar hazeh ozeh v'im shnehem kechad tovim. You don't know, right? What will come of you feel that you can rest on your laurels. You can't, because perhaps the success will only come in what you do later on. Rabbi Akiva Omer, lamad Torah bialduto yilmod Torah b'ziknuto. So by the same token, on a personal growth level, just because you studied something or Torah in your youth, you shouldn't let up when you're older. Hayulo talmidim biyalduto, yulo talmidim beziknuto. If you had students in your youth, continue to have students in your ziknut, and then it quotes the same pasuk. And then in this context, Amru, it was said, Shnei Masar Elef Zugim Talmidim Hayulo LeRabbi Akiva. Migvat ad Antripas. So Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 chavutot, pairs of students, 24,000. The kulan metu beperek achad mipnei shelo nagu kavod zelazeh. So Rabbi Akiva had this educational empire, 24,000 students, and they all died because they didn't give proper kavod to one another. V'haya olam shamem. And the world was desolate. Achaba Rabbi Akiva etzel rabotenu shebidaram ushna elahem. And Rabbi Akiva came to the Rabbanim in the south and taught them. Who were they? Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, the great Tanaim of that generation. All of our Torah goes through that very thin bottleneck. Vehem hem hemidu Torah tasha'a. And they were the ones who kept the Torah going. Tana, kulam metu mi Pesach v'atzeret. So now, that's the original source. And now Tana means that there is a tradition which is related to it. Okay, so this is if you will, another layer on the original. In the original source, it doesn't say when they died. It's just beperek echad. So when was that perek? Be Pesach v'ad atzeret. It was from Pesach until Shavuot. Amar Rav Chama bar Abba v'Item Rabbi Chia bar Avin kulam metu meitara'a. So this isn't mentioned either. This is even later tradition. This is Amoraim who are talking hundreds of years later that they died a terrible death. And what was it? Amar Rav Nachman Askara. It was cholera. Okay, so that was that's the Gemara. Okay, so no mention of any ramifications for us other than to perhaps give more kavod to one another, right? There's no mention of any commemoration or anything like that. This is just the story. Certainly not mention of Lag BaOmer. Nothing is here. Okay. Now there is a haskalic, call it innovation, or call it by this point, since it was written in the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, we could say a haskalic tradition. Okay, of Rav Nachman Krochmal in his Moreh Nevuchei Hazman. So that why did they die, right? Or how did they die? They were actually, this is part of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. It was that they were Rabbi Akiva, who was the rabbinic patron of Bar Kokhba, who viewed Bar Kokhba as the Mashiach. So it follows that his students would be the, if you will, the Hesdernikim of that, and Rachman son. So they died in that terrible catastrophe for which it took over 1800 years for the Jewish people to regain the independence here in Eretz Yisrael. So that is the idea. It's as good a guess as any other. It's assuming that these Talmidim were all of military age, and that they were serving the army, etc. And we can have another discussion, and that they didn't get a tour of Terasa of Nassau, etc. Okay, fine, whatever. But who knows? It could be. But that, as if the Avelut had started at that point. As if the Gemara says because of the Minhagim of Avelut, because of that. So then I would say, okay, this makes sense. In other words, this is sort of like a commemoration of a tremendous Churban. Right? We commemorate on Tisha B'Av, one of the Mishnah says, one of the 5 things that occurred on Tisha B'Av, tragedies, was that that Beitar fell on Tisha B'Av. Right? Bar Kokhba's last stand was on Beitar, and the slaughter of Beitar took place on Tisha B'Av. So it's certainly something that's deserving of of commemoration, and until the Shoah, it very well might have been the greatest single catastrophe, even eclipsing in terms of numbers dying the Churban Bayit itself. So to say that this is something which is worthy of Avelut is certainly true, but then it should have happened much earlier. Right? It shouldn't have to wait till later on. But it's important to know that this is frequently quoted. But you should know where the source is. It comes from the Nachman Krachwell, and also it's something to think about, but it's not necessarily so clear. Be that as it may, where does now things pop up in the halachic literature? Right? And as we've spoken about with regard to Minhagim, we spoke about it with regard to Kitnios, things can be going on without there being a literary record of it. Right? Minhagim, right, don't necessarily, they especially if they're grassroots types of Minhagim, so they might be floating around and then they are mentioned. So this is just the first mention that I'm familiar with in any event. So here, v'shaltem lama ein mekadshin ve'ein konsin ben Pesach la'atzeret im machmat isur olav. So the minhag already exists. Someone asks one of the Gaonim, so we're talking about, let's say, somewhere in the 800s, 900s, etc. Right? Why don't people get married between Pesach and Shavuot? And the minhag here seems to be from Pesach till Shavuot, because that's the question. Mi Pesach ad Atzeret. Why don't we get married? So Havi Yodin Shalom Mishum Isurhu Ela Mishum Minhag Avelut. So the reason for this, understand, is because it is a minhag of Avelut. Shekachamru Chachamim. Now, so here in the period of the Gaonim, it's interesting. It wasn't well known because, as I said, the Rambam doesn't mention it. At least to the best of my knowledge, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe Mr. Rambam, but it is here mentioned in the Gaonim, but only specifically with regard to this minhag not to get married, and so they quote the Gemara. However, he says, I should have put it in bold, two lines from the bottom, so the claim of the Gaon is that this is an ancient minhag, going back to the time of Rabbi Akiva. There's a minhag not to get married, even though it's not mentioned in the Gemara, it's not mentioned in the in any work before this. Right? What we saw in the Shulchan Aruch, already found in the Gaonim, that if people found a cheap hall and they got married, so we're not going to penalize them anyway. Lo onesh velo malkot, right? Not any monetary punishment, not lashes. Aval im bali shol lechatchila ein morim lo lichnos. Right? So if if they ask this question, so we tell them it's okay. It's the minhag. Don't get married now. Right? And similarly, there is no. And then the last line is that there is no such minhag with regard to engagement, which we saw already in the Shulchan Aruch as well. Another, but that Lag Bomer is not mentioned in the Gaonim. No, the original minhag, as is quoted, is from Pesach until Shavuot, right?
Today it's basically from Pesach till
Right, correct. So we'll continue with that. So now there's another Gaonic minhag. Rabbeinu Hai b'tshuva. So here we have the previous Gaon was anonymous. We don't know which Gaon it was. But here it's Rabbeinu Hai Gaon. So this is the 11th century, beginning of the 11th century. And so he's saying, Ma shenahagu shelo la'asot melacha b'pesach v'ad atzeret mishkiat v'chama v'ad shacharit. So there's a minhag not to do any work after Shkia in the evenings throughout this period of time. Did you know that minhag? Right? Okay. So this is the minhag. So the Mishum Talmidei Rabbi Akiva shemetu shekulam metu mishkiat achama v'nikberu achar shkiat achama. Right? It was the time that they had to be buried. V'hayu ha'am b'telim mimlacha. So people didn't do work. Okay. So that's the minhag. Right? Now that minhag is actually brought in the Shulchan Aruch. I move things around. If it's Seif Dalet, I read the first three Seifim of the Shulchan Aruch. Seif Dalet is Nahagu Hanashim Shelo La'asot Melacha Mi Pesach V'ad Atzeret Mishkiat Achama Ve'elach. Right. So by the time it becomes at that point a minhag of the women, and if you take a look at the Achronim on the Shulchan Aruch, they say men too. Right? But that minhag has stopped. Right? Yeah.
You're referring to the students of Rabbi Akiva that they had to be buried in the afternoon?
In which they died, and then every night they would have these funerals for whoever died that day.
But take a step backwards and apologize. If you're making this a period of Avelut, right? The period of Avelut for someone who wants to get married is generally you don't, unless there's going to be an issue. So maybe they're applying that
What do you mean? What do you mean by they don't unless there's an issue?
Unless you're going to lose the
Okay, so the minhag is to not to, and
so if you're applying the laws of Avelut, then you would apply it to this as well.
what to doing malacha?
If you're looking at the period of Sphira as Avelut,
Right.
then apply the laws of Avelut.
Okay, they said it. There might be under extreme circumstances. Similarly, with regard where the minhag, the halachot are much more deeply entrenched between Shivasar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. So if there is a dire circumstance for whatever the reason, where a couple just must get married, and if they don't get married, then something is going to spin out of control, whatever that might be. So then Posky might say, okay, under these circumstances, but that's the exception to the rule. But here, what the Gaonim are saying is that there is a loose minhag not to get married, and generally speaking, this is what we'll tell people. But if they decide that they want to do it differently, okay, right? Nishkafelach. That's basically what you see in the Gaonim, and it seems to be a more deeply entrenched minhag, which is more or less been forgotten today, of not engaging in malacha until afterwards. How do we get around if people don't do it anymore? How could they just forget? So the poskim said this is a minhag which, even though the Gaonim said it's because of this, but once you count the Omer at night, so then you shouldn't do malacha until you count the Omer. But once you've counted the Omer, so then you can do malacha. Okay. I know it's minhagim. It shouldn't be too surprising because there is a certain amount of fluidity when it comes to these kind of customs. Yeah.
Asur Malacha is because of Avilut or because of it being?
Well, it's not really Avilut. It's I don't recall Avilut. It's called So it seems to be So is it because in order to remember to count Sphira, is it as sort of a commemoration of what was done, right? In other words, what are you doing instead, right? It's etc. It's not totally clear. Number 7. Okay, now we're moving forward. Yeah.
Just possibly be sort of like a little bit of like Chalamoid being extended from Pesach to Shavuot, just like only it's more closer together, Sukkot into Sukkot Torah.
Okay, it could be, but it does. There's no mention of it. Right? It's just it's similar to, you can think of other places like on Rosh Chodesh. Even Rosh Chodesh, women have a minhag of not doing. There's a minhag for women not to do malacha. There's the idea of not doing malacha when the Hanukkah menorah is burning, etc. There are other instances where we have something similar for all sorts of different reasons. It's not something which is totally unheard of, but. My point in bringing it is that, I remember the first time that I saw it, I said, oh, really? I didn't know that. Right? It's not something which I was aware of, as opposed to the practice of not getting married, or by extension, parties, music, etc., and not shaving. So that's something that I grew up with. But when it came to the idea of of not doing malacha, that was something which I came to much later. Yeah.
I'm not sure what are you trying to say? Let's take the minhag you just mentioned of women not working during Shabbos candle, Hanukkah candles, or not working on Shabbos. Are you saying that is the same as not shaving?
No. What I'm trying to say is that there are minhagim, and I'm just trying to, if you will, show you how things are developing. I'm not trying to make certainly any judgment in terms of the nature of the minhagim, etc. All I'm trying to say is that you have minhagim that are developing over time. Right? We haven't even reached Lag BaOmer yet. I got 20 minutes left, and we're going to get to it. These things are you have to take a look at it and say, wow. So let's move forward, because as I said, I really don't have much time left. Uminhag b'chol Yisrael. Okay, this is the Ritzgeyat. So he is in 12th century, if I recall correctly, 12th century in Spain. And so he's saying the following: Minhag b'chol Yisrael shelo lisa b'chol Yisrael already. Remember, it was the Gaonim. We heard about this minhag. What should we do? By the time he's writing, so he's saying it, at least in Spain and I guess in North Africa, etc. This is a universally held minhag. Shelo lisav ben Pesach la'atzeret mishum avelut hu v'lo mishum isur. But he stresses, don't think that it's forbidden. It's not forbidden. It is still a minhag, and therefore shekach amru chachamim, and he quotes the Gemara, v'davka nisuin shikar simcha b'chupa v'knisa. Right, then even this minhag is only with regard to marriages, because that's where the chuppah, that's where the real simcha is. Aval ha'areis u'lekadesh lo, but to have erusin, to have the kiddushin, the engagement, which at that time was separated from the nisuin. Today, of course, it's all the same. So, and then he continues the quote, right, that if the person did get married, it's okay, don't worry about it, etc. That is but my point here is that by the 12th century, at least in certain areas, it's become a universally held custom, and the Ritzgeyat feels he has to push back against it a little bit, that people shouldn't think it's too severe, right? That it's only a minhag, it's not an isur. So then we now move forward to, we're still in the 12th century, the end of the 12th century, and this is in Provence, the Sefer HaManhig. So he says the following, Ba'ach minhagu, it's in bold, B'tzarfat u'b'Provencia lichnos milamed gimel la'omer ve'elach. So this is the first mention of Lag BaOmer as being significant. The minhag here is to get married, Vishamati, and I heard, why? Like, until now, every single source has just said Pesach Adatzer, Pesach Adatzer, Pesach till Shavuot. That's it. Right? Where does Lag BaOmer come from? So he says, Vishamati b'shem Rabbeinu Zrachia mi Gerona. So the great Bal HaMaor. So I heard from in his name, Shematza Katuv b'Sefer Yashan Haba Misfarad, that he found an old document that came from Spain. It's like, I heard that he found, and that it was a really old book, right? This is just a little sketchy. Shemetu mi Pesach va'ad pros ha'atzeret. They didn't die until Atzeret, but till the half point of Atzeret. What does that mean? So it's code, pros. What is pros? Pros is half. So without reading it inside, it means that you take the month beforehand and cut it into two. This is where it's used in other connections, and that gives you 15 days, right? So go count back from Shavuot, 15 days, you get to Lag BaOmer. So they only died until then, right? So this is, by the time the Meiri, this is now in the 13th century, about 100 years later, so he said the Kabbalah, what's underlined there, Kabbalah biyad ha-geonim. It's now a Kabbalah. It's not a, document that was found somewhere in someone's attic, etc. But rather, this is the Kabbalah from the Gaonim, going all the way back to those Gaonim. Shemiyom Lag BaOmer Paska Mita v'Noagim Mito Kach Shelo Litaned Bo. This is when they stopped dying. And it was what we were taught in elementary school. So it comes from this Meiri. Right? This Meiri is the first source who says it. They died, what?
Meiri was in Ashkenaz, right?
No, he's in Provence. It's sort of like in between, right, Ashkenaz and Sfarad. So again, he's not saying that he's not the one who's making the Chiddush. He's saying already this was earlier, but there it was, I heard maybe because of this, and now this is the Kabbalah from the Gaonim, that they died until Lag BaOmer, right? It's not the Gemara, this is the Meiri, etc. So this is where it comes from. Fine. And we could skip number 10. This is where the question of, is it on the Lamed Gimel, Lamed Daled? We don't have time to get into that right now because I want to move on. So now, what about the other minhag? Right, so we see how we got from Pesach ad Atzeret, and now we got to Lag BaOmer. Okay. How did we get? By the way, there has been no mention in all of these earlier sources about haircuts. I don't know if you noticed that. No mention of haircuts. The only minhag that's there is not getting married. That's it, and not doing malacha. No mention at all of the of haircuts in any way. So beforehand, let's have just a certain historical view, and this is number 11. I'm not going to read it inside now, but this is just taken from the Encyclopedia Judaica, and basically and we now are in 1096, right? The terrible period of the First Crusade, Tatnu. And the First Crusade, which may have its impact perhaps even to this very day. So the march through the Rhineland and the slaughter of the Jewish communities in the Rhineland all took place in the Sfirat HaOmer, culminating on Shavuot itself. Right, and so here are the dates. You can take a look on the bottom of the page. On the 8th of Iyar, the Crusaders surrounded the synagogue of Speyer, able to break. They attacked the Jews outside the synagogue, etc. And that's the first recorded instance where a woman or a Jew, in this case she was a woman, who was the first one recorded to do it, who chose martyrdom rather than forced conversion. So the whole idea of Kiddush Hashem, which is so prevalent at that time, even to the extent, and we talked about this other times, where a very controversial question of killing children so that they wouldn't fall in, and suicides so that you wouldn't fall into the hands of the Crusaders. The 23rd of Iyar, so they're in Vermeiza, they're in Worms. On the 3rd of Sivan, right? They're in Cologne, etc. In Cologne, it's on the 6th of Sivan on Shavuot itself. So this is a terrible, terrible time. And of course, it continues afterwards all the way till Eretz Yisrael. I heard somebody after October 7th say that since the time of Bar Kokhba, this was the worst slaughter in Israel in those 1800 years. So it's not true. Unfortunately, it's not true. Because during the Crusades, when they captured Yerushalayim, they gathered all of the Jews together. At the time, the Jewish quarter is now where the Muslim quarter is, and they gathered all the Jews into the shul and burnt it down. And there were different records of how many, but there were several thousand Jews who died in the Crusades here in Yerushalayim. So this was a incredibly tragic and incredibly impactful time on Jewish history and on Ashkenazic Jewish history specifically, and it has its impact. So take two not very well known works, but they are manuscripts where they describe. In fact, one of them I think is only found in manuscript. Is that the Od Nirali, number 12? Ma she'ein nosin nashim ben Pesach la'atzeret. Right? Why is this? Mipnei tzar ha'gzeirot shenehergu ha'kilot b'chol ze ha'malchut u'mitanin aleihen. Why do we not have marriages during this time? This is written in the 13th century, so it's a couple hundred years later. Why don't we have it? Is because this is the time when the communities were killed in the First Crusade. Umaskirin nishmatan ba'otan Shabbatot, and that's why we have the what we say all the time, Avarachamim, right? Was composed at this time, and there's the question, when Rosh Chodesh falls on Shabbat, someone asks, what happens if Rosh Chodesh Iyar falls on Shabbat? Right? So do you say Av Harachamim? Right? So the old joke is that the minhag is to argue about it. Okay, fine. But the actual minhag is to say it. Why? Because it was said specifically, at one point Av Harachamim was said every Shabbat throughout the year, but especially being said during this period of time. Right? Because this is the time when the communities were being slaughtered. So that's being found here as with regard to that, and that's why we do say it when it falls out on Rosh, even if it's Rosh Chodesh, when you're Mevarich Rosh Chodesh, etc. The next source in the table here, number 13, right? So here is the first mention of that I'm familiar with of the idea of not getting haircuts. Uminhag tov shelo listaper v'shelo lechanech ksut v'shum davar chadash, and you shouldn't wear any new clothing. Leitaneg b'merchatz, so it's beyond what we do. You shouldn't go and hang out in the bathhouse. V'lasot tzipornav, and to get a manicure or a pedicure. Be'acharei pesach ad atzerech l'chvod hachasidim atmimim v'yisharim shemasru atzmam al kedushat Hashem. This is this commemorative period, and this is, again, we're talking about 300 years later, 200, 300 years later. So there's a real period of Avelut that's going on, but much more similar to what happens today. So the Minhagim, there are the Chabad, I think, don't say Shechiyanu during Sfirat HaOmer, but the idea of not saying the Shechiyanu during the 3 weeks is not kept during Sfirat HaOmer. But here you're talking about the same type of Avelut that we're familiar with during the 3 weeks. They were practicing during all of Sfirat HaOmer, right? From Pesach ad Atzeret. So that is but it's not at all because of Rabbi Akiva. Right? No one's mentioning Rabbi Akiva here. It's because of the much more recent troubles that they were having.
Why don't they do that for the Shabbat? Why don't somebody after the Shabbat say, we should do this?
Okay. All right. There were times that I got 6 minutes left. So now as we move forward, so you can see that. Basically, I'll just look at number 15 quickly. Lag ba'omer lo'olam hu yudchet bi'iyar u'v'shachrit ein omrim. Now, by the way, none of these earlier sources say directly that this is where we're going to now only keep from Rosh Chodesh Iyar. But remember, before Rosh Chodesh Iyar, the Crusades haven't happened yet. Crusades only happened during Iyar. However, let's continue. Now, in the end of the 14th century, Lag ba'omer la'olam hu yudchet b'iyar. Lag ba'omer always falls on the 18th of the year. U'v'shacharit ein omrim tchina. B'megensium v'remaisa omrim tchina b'lag ba'omer. So, in the Rhineland communities, they said tachanun on Lag ba'omer because, after all, this is right. This is a terrible period of time in that collective memory. Amar Mari Segal Alpha Gav Diita B'Gemara Tamida Rabbi Akiva Meitu Bei Pesach Ad Atzeret Mikol Makom Osim B'Yom Lag Ba'omer Yom Simcha Mishum Demeitu Rak HaYomim She'omrim Bahen Tchina B'Shiva Shavuot HaOmer. So you have the creeping in of the other minhag that's coming in. You have this convergence of the minhag from Spain and Gaonim about Rabbi Akiva. And you have the Avelut for the Crusades, right? And they are combining and merging into something which is a little different. So going back to there, where did Lag BaOmer come from? So there is it's not totally clear where this Sorah came from. That they only died, remember, if they're dying because of a plague or because of divine punishment, that miraculously they only died on days where you'd say tachanun. Any day that was a Yom Tov, they didn't die. So they say that based on that, they didn't die on Shabbat, right? Bahashta, now, Dal min Memtet Yom. So this is what you're supposed to do. Take off the 49 days, subtract Shivat Yemei Chag, the 7 days of Pesach. Gimel Yamim Dechal Ben Rosh Chodesh, Shnayim Li'iyar V'echad L'Sivan. So you have 3 days of Rosh Chodesh in this period of time. That's 10. Sheva Shabbatot. You have now 70. Pashul Luhu Lamed Bet. That leaves you 32 days that they actually died. Nimtza lo metu rak lamed bet yamim, l'chein keshekalu oto lamed bet yamim, shemetu osin l'macharatan simcha l'zecher. So then they stopped dying like Omer. It doesn't mention the Mesorah that that document that they found. No, they just do a little bit of math. Why do we pick Lag BaOmer? They continued to die throughout, but we just have a concentrated 32 days. So we have 32 days. Come Lag BaOmer. Okay, they only died 32 days, so therefore on the 33rd we can now say we can move forward. Yeah.
One of those 7 Shabbatot, wouldn't it also be during Pesach, either Yom Tov or Chol Hamoed?
I don't know. You could be. You might be right. I don't know. I've never thought about that. What happens though? If you take a look, there are 3 Minhagim, 3 primary Minhagim. There are some variations on all of them. If you take the three primary Minhagim, so the first one, Lag BaOmer, right? You're doing 30 to 32 days, and comes Lag BaOmer, and there's a question: why Lad the 34th as opposed to 33rd? Do you take the 33rd as a full day of the Avela period, or just a partial day? Whatever. But it's basically 32 days. That's Lag BaOmer. Fine. If you count from Rosh Chodesh Iyar until again after Rosh Chodesh Iyar, from starting on Bet Iyar until Erev Shavuot, same 33 days. The third minhag, which I'm not going to read inside now because I want to, for 2 minutes, talk a little bit about Lag BaOmer, is Lag BaOmer is brought in the Magen Avraham. There's a third minhag not to basically for the complete Omer, to not have haircuts with the exception of on Lag BaOmer itself. And if you count, based on what the Maharil said, there are again 32 days of actual Avelut. So, okay, on Shabbat, I'm not going to have Avelut. It doesn't help me to get a haircut. It doesn't help me to get married. But I'm not having Avelut on Shabbat. I'm not having Avelut on Rosh Chodesh. Perhaps the minhag to have their haircuts on Rosh Chodesh itself starts because people had the entire time. In other words, if you're taking the full 49 days, so then you can get a haircut on Rosh Chodesh because you have 33 days of Avelut. Right? So you have the different customs. Very quickly, 1 minute left. Lag BaOmer. Okay, I just want to point out that this is where things have totally changed. Right? Here you have, okay, they stopped. So what are you going to do? Okay, fine. Maybe you'll whatever. It's a very, when they say the minor holidays, right? Lag BaOmer is as minor holidays you're going to get unless you go to Meron, right? And of course, which is the largest gathering, the largest single gathering of Jews throughout the year, right? Is in Meron on Lag BaOmer, and so I don't have time to get into it. I'm just going to just say the following: the idea of the it really starts out as being a day which already it's a Kabbalistic idea, Kabbalistic holiday, that it was a day that not the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai died, right? Perhaps there was, but that he didn't die, right? Because he's one of those 5 students who were mentioned, right? So here there are 2 versions, and this is the idea, and there's a question. A student already beforehand, it's clear that people are going up, and even the idea of Upshir of Chalakah on at Lag BaOmer already goes before. It's not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch, but it is going on. The Ari seems to do it. So just brought a piece from the Sfarim blog, and you can read it afterwards. A student of Rabbi of the Ari, perhaps his most famous student, Rav Chaim Vital, in his Priyetz Chaim, so he talks about this. And here, if you take a look, the version that people are familiar with is this first version that's there. And the last two lines where you see the underlines on page 5, Hatam, and the rationale for this, the reason for this, is because Shemet Rashbi biyom lag ba'omer. Kihu mitamidei Rabbi Akiva hana. Okay? The only problem is that that's the second printing. In the first printing, if you take a look, it's there on the underline, it's in the fourth line from the bottom. Ki gam Rashbi aya mitamidei Rabbi Akiva v'hu samach delag ba'omer. Okay? In other words, it got that there was a mix-up between samach and... Now, you'll say, okay, this is the choker, medenish, etc. So, the Reb Zebin, in his Moedim B'Halacha, in Lag BaOmer, so he has a piece, and he talks about it. There's some Makorit here about the controversy. There are different Achronim who were very much opposed to what goes on. I don't have time to get into it now. But so he mentions the source, this source of the Yom Shemet. He quotes the Pri Chadash in it. And he was Rav Zevin was Chabad. He was a Chabad Chassid. He wasn't Lubavitch. He was from Babrisk. But he was very close with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe wrote him a letter after the publishing of the of Moedim B'Halacha, and he has the following comment with regard to this. This is number 21, and I got this source also from that blog spot. And he says that you should know that it is a printing mistake, because he says in the original Karetz edition it's not there, etc., and it's because this mistake got in, and you should, just the last two lines, Uval mechaber hasefer dvarim ni'imim, right? You who've written such a lovely book, kinireh lo ra'ah et sefer hakavanot. You didn't see the source that pointed out the printing mistake. Mide'ena mevio mikama tamim me'enachon lefi anati taken et tanal b'sifrel. Right, so you should make it in the next edition. You should correct the mistake. At the very least, point out the questions that arise, and so you shouldn't say, "Oh, there's this minhag, that this besora that goes back to Rabbi Akiva, that Rashbi died at this time, goes back 1800 years." No, it's later and might be based on a printing error, etc. You should clear the record. I looked at later editions of Moedim B'Halacha. So in the first edition, he quotes that line. In subsequent, I didn't see, there's a subsequent edition which I didn't look at, the middle edition. But in the last edition, which he printed in 1980, the first one was printed in 1959, I think, 1980, which was printed right after around when he passed away. The line is taken out. In other words, it doesn't quote the line, but there's no explanation. In other words, it's just saying Lag BaOmer is a day with, when the Arizal went up and whatever, and it leaves the idea of the Yom Shemet. He just took it out, but he didn't say, "Oh, it's based on a mistake," or no footnote. It's just the way. Okay, but Minhagim change, right? And we have the Avelut has morphs throughout the centuries and changes, and don't have time to talk about recent developments in the Avelut. And of course, Lag BaOmer in Meron, has been changing, and it's a hot topic. Ad Hayom Hazeh. Okay.
What about a bonfire?
So that's also part of it, which I didn't get to. All right. That's all.